Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, Chinese President Xi Jinping tells an assembly of academics not to hold back in pushing the frontiers of science and technology. With this drive and ambition, how close is China to achieving the dream of a leading country in innovation? And Malaysia's new Prime Minister, in media reports, seeks to cancel a high-speed rail link between Kuala Lumpur and Singapore. What are the hard lessons learned in pursuing multi-billion-dollar mega projects? You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The meeting of the academicians of the Chinese Academy of Sciences and the Chinese Academy of Engineering is underway in China and is set to wrap up on June the 1st. The meeting is important. At the opening ceremony, Chinese President Xi Jinping has emphasized just how important science and technology is to China's future. He also called on the country to pull out all the stops in pushing innovation and take full charge of core technologies.
Tremendous achievements have been made in the past few years, and more can be expected in the years ahead. Chinese President Xi Jinping said, amid the new science revolution and reshaping of the global landscape, the need for cutting-edge technology has never been as profound today in determining the destiny of a country and the livelihood of its people. He also emphasized the importance of innovation.
The new era of socialism with Chinese characteristics has been clear, and the massive ship of the Chinese nation's rejuvenation is riding the winds and waves. Let us unite closely, enhance our confidence, and overcome difficulties in order to move towards building China into a world leader of science and technology.
China has made many notable achievements in science and technology since its opening up. The country launched Tiangong-2 in 2016. The Space Lab can accommodate the medium-length stay of astronauts and test life support technologies. The country made its first step in sending a human to space in 2003, when astronaut Yang Liwei accomplished the Shenzhou 5 mission. China's homegrown passenger plane, the C919, took off its maiden flight in 2017. The country's latest J-20 stealth fighters were commissioned into Air Force Combat Service in February to better safeguard the nation's sovereignty and national security. In 2017, Chinese manned submersible Jialong descended to 6,699 meters in the Mariana Trench, the world's deepest point. China's first self-developed bullet train, Fuxing, boasts a consistent speed of 350 kilometers per hour. The country has 22,000 kilometers of high-speed railway, which makes up 60% of the world's total. More achievements can be seen in various fields, including quantum communication, radio signal detection, neutrino research, and artificial intelligence. China has the world's largest army of science and technology workers, but it still lacks core innovation capacity. The country is now determined to strengthen its hand in this field, with the aim of creating more opportunities for itself and the rest of the world.
What does it take to become a leading country in technology and innovation in our world today? That is a big question. I'm sure everybody has their answers. Therefore, we invite a panel in Beijing studio. We have Liu Debing, someone who has been involving over the years with China's general technologies. Welcome, sir, to our program. In Los Angeles, we have Jonathan Watsu, the director of McKinsey Global Institute. I hope you'll come in with more analysis coming from different perspectives. And in Washington, D.C., Dr. Ernest McDuffie, founder of the Global McDuffie Group. That's one group that's dealing with online issues. Let me start with Mr. Watzel and also Mr. McDuffie, because I want to some have observations coming from the outside. Mr. Watzel, what is your assessment in terms of China's level of science and technological capabilities on the global stage, briefly?
Well, sure, Tian. Thanks for the question. And I think China is fast growing its capacities, but it's still not yet at the level we can say that it's the leader, if you will, in science and technology in most areas. That it's investing a lot, that it certainly has, if you will, the raw talent, but it's lacking some critical aspects, notably core technologies, as you mentioned, also talent. I think it's a reality that talent is a global phenomenon, and that China will need to bring in more global talent to China if China is going to have global science and innovation capacity. But you know, it's a fast-moving thing, it's an opportunity, and I think China is improving in many areas. China is already at the cutting edge.
All right. Dr. McDuffie, your assessment coming certainly from the new technologies perspective, from internet-related technologies as well. Mr. McDuffie.
So I would agree. I think China has a lot of potential. They're certainly moving in the right direction. Their speed of increase of capability is impressive. I think that the main factor that's holding China back is a lack of openness. Scientific knowledge, technological advance is a global phenomena, and to really not so much worry about catching up, but to get ahead, to lead a challenge, to be innovative, you have to embrace knowledge globally. You have to be able to integrate all of that into your local processes.
So is money the issue, Mr. Liu?
Well, I would not really completely agree to that comments. And of course, you know, for many years, especially after China door opened, gradually, you know, I think invested a lot, achieved a lot, and so achievements we have seen, observed from outside, inside, you know, shows the progress China has ever made in the last 4 decades.
I didn't get your point, sir. You're saying China made a lot of progress. I think that's exactly the other two guests have been talking about. But they are saying that there are things that China still needs to do. I don't know whether you agree with them about that or not. And my question is China's money going to be an issue, or actually some other factors, as the other panelists that just mentioned, are going to be the issues that we need to handle right now?
Okay, the money issue is always there. You know, without money, without investment, nothing can be generated. But besides of money, I think a lot of other things need to be done as well. Like education, like, you know, to exchange of ideas, and like to make a lot of experimental projects, like to really make, you know, put all those theoretical technologies into practice to be connected with China's reality of our economy.
All right. A lot of factors mentioned by our three-person panel. Let's take a look, first of all, whether China is lack of money in terms of investment into the new technologies. Chinese investment in high technology are on the rise. Take a look at this. 2017, Chinese government invested about $273 billion on research and development, second only to the United States. Commercially, Chinese venture capitalists invested about $6.8 billion in the high-tech industry, counting for nearly 24% of the total amount of capital in the market. In 2017, China also overtook Japan, becoming the second largest economy on patent application, with a total of nearly 49,000, about 20% of the world's total. So those numbers seeing, as all of you have been suggesting, not lack of money. The money is being put up there. And let all of you have been suggesting, China is on the rise when it comes to acquiring more technological and innovation capabilities. But all of you have been talking about different factors, ranging from education to investing and attracting talent, as well as openness, as well as the atmosphere of science and technology, how it's being conducted within the country. But another issue I need to raise here, Mr. McDuffie, is that we don't want to ignore the factor. Since you're coming from outside China, I have to mention this, that the technological imports into China from Western countries have always been difficult. And therefore, how much is that linked to China's way of thinking, building its system to nurture science and technology? How much is that, in a way, preventing China from knowing and practicing the interactions with the rest of the world?
Yeah, clearly that's a factor. The cultural differences between China and other parts of the world have to have an impact. But I think the reality, the global reality, particularly when you look at issues like the global supply chain, when you talk about advances in technology, all those end products end up being created, manufactured in a global sense. Everything, there's pieces of it being made over here, over there. You have to have a standards of manufacturing, standards of quality control to make the global supply chain work effectively. And that's happening and will continue to happen. And so because of that, the kind of 20th century concepts of trade wars and protectionism are rapidly eroding because they're not taking into account the fact that things are manufactured and created in a global supply chain. And so the whole world participates in that activity. So the more cooperation and collaboration globally that you can have, particularly at the education level and the fundamental research level, before you get into actual competition over products, the better off the whole world becomes, the more stable the world becomes, and the less issues there are.
McDuffie, I would love to agree with you, and indeed I do agree with you, but if you look at whether trade war or not, even though that is not the topic for today because we're talking about science and technological development from China with the world, even though that could play a factor. And if we talk about the basic research, even recently, NASA is having problems. Just one example of having the opportunity to cooperate with China, even though scientists from both sides have been longing for that opportunity for decades, not to mention the other sectors. So those are just some of the very simple examples. But having said that, though, Mr. Waltzel, I'm not here to talk about, well, China is because being boycotted by the others, and therefore China has not developed a system of its own to develop science and technology. But here we need to really take a look at some of the specific questions about education. The Asian system of education is mainly about memorizing, following the teachers. And of course, some argue that is not necessarily in tune with the critical thinking urgently needed when a country system should be about, try to nurture science and technology and innovation. Mr. Waltzel, what do you think?
Well, it's a hotly debated topic in educational circles. I have to say that at the levels that we're talking about in terms of scientific breakthroughs and advances, China's shown that it has obviously got some great scientific genius. I mean, whether we're talking about AI or bio, or I mean, when I graduated from university in USC about 30 years ago, you could count on the fingers of two hands the number of non-Chinese names in the sciences that were graduating. So we kind of already have known for many years that the next generation of scientific entrepreneurs and engineers will be Chinese. The real question is, where will they be? Will they be in China? Will they be in the U.S.? Will they be somewhere else? Who will they be working for? It's a global war for talent, as Mr. McDuffie says. And I think for China, in a sense, to fight with one hand tied behind its back by only looking at resources from China in China is to be at a disadvantage. China has to be open to global talent. And Chinese education, of course, needs to reflect that, too. In the Chinese educational system, we need to see international educators. We need to see international curriculum. We need to see international languages. And so I'm sure that China can do that. It's just a matter of practice, perhaps.
Well, if I could ask Mr. Liu here, I have to beg to differ. Even though, as a host of the debate, I cannot express my opinions much. But if you look at the kinds of projects that China has been having over the past decade about attracting overseas Chinese talent, it is massive. And many of these talents coming back to China, they got a lot of money for research, they got the team, they also got favorable treatment than their local talents being here in China. Some even argue that the problem is not about whether to attract the many overseas talents back to China, but rather how to nurture and further encourage the talents that are already here in China. After all, many of those overseas went overseas from China. So, Mr. Liu, can I put that question to you?
Okay, very good. This is a very good question. And actually, in the last 4 decades, many overseas students, Chinese, went to study in foreign countries. They returned. They returned and they did a lot of good things for this country, economically, technically, and of course, I would say that for those local talents here in China, they were, to a certain extent, they were neglected. They didn't were given equally opportunity and conditions for them to practice their talents in the country or in their institute.
Interesting. So we see one difference in opinion when it comes to what kind of talents to tap in, where emphasis should be. Another thing about the so-called adaptive innovation versus disruptive innovation. Mr. McDuffie, of course, people would love to embrace disruptive innovation. But also people also see, over the past few decades, China's experience and, in a way, achievement of practicing adaptive innovation. So between these two, what is the way out where one has to embrace both of them? Can it be possible at this stage of development for China? Mr. McDuffie, from your perspective.
Yeah, it's certainly possible, and I think you're absolutely correct. You must embrace both of them because you have no control. I mean, both types of innovation will occur, have occurred, will continue to occur, and if you're not able to deal with them, you're going to again be, at a disadvantage. It's certainly more difficult to deal with the disruptive innovations because, as the name implies, it disrupts things. But whenever you have disruption, you also have opportunity for advancements that didn't exist before. Adaptive innovation is the steady state. Is kind of like the safe investment that's going to pay dividends as it moves forward at a constant rate. And so you certainly have to pay attention to that as well. But you must find a way to do both things at the same time. I believe that China, as the rest of the world, is certainly capable of doing that.
Then, Mr. Waltzel, what does it take to do disruptive innovation? How much is it linked to the research system, to the mainly links between the market, the research, and the government? How is that relationship should be streamed up from your perspective, Mr. Waltzel?
Sure. Well, I think just we have to define our terms a little bit. When we say innovation, we mean a change in a product or a service that creates commercial value. So it's not copying, but it's also not invention. It's doing something that matters in the marketplace, and that takes us a step forward. By that dimension, China's been disrupting things for a very long time, at least in China. I mean, if you stood on the ground in China over the last 30 years, literally you would have been disrupted from everything from mobility to the workplace to where you buy your food. So China's actually very comfortable with the idea of disruption based on consumer demand, first of all, based on the increasing capabilities of its factories, the infrastructure, and importantly based on its gradual adoption of engineering and supplier networks. But if you take that next step that you're talking about in science-based innovation, then yeah, I think it is a lot about the collaboration between education and research and the marketplace. Importantly, big customers demanding engineering projects. That's pretty critical. Funding, of course, it matters. But most importantly, I'll come back to again is talent. I think without the core scientific talent gathered together in a cluster, which requires quality of life, which requires, as you say, freedom of information and a capacity for discovery, and it importantly requires a mix of talent from all. That's what really brings together the scientific opportunity. And I would note finally that China does have that in many cities of China. In fact, China is one of the most global places for disruptive innovation in the world. If we look at the science parks of Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen, these are global environments. And so now China has to harness that to turn it into global innovation.
To turn it into global innovation, Mr. Liu, from China's perspective, if you can, help us to understand What has China realized so far in order to make that happen?
Well, for globalization and go global, that is Chinese aim. And, this could result in two fields for China to benefit China's development. One is that going globally and attracting global talents, then improve our domestic, our internal renovation, to encourage our internal renovation. And also go global, to find resources and cooperate with the international community. That would be really for mutual benefit of all.
Talking about basic research, Mr. McDuffie, it takes a lot of effort and a long time, a lot of patience, a lot of money, quote unquote, wasted. Not necessarily so, in fact, at the end of the day. But it takes a system that is patient with what is happening now and what could happen for tomorrow, Mr. McDuffie.
Yeah, absolutely. The hard problems that the world faces, climate change, space, energy, clean water, food, there's a whole list of very difficult global problems that will require global collaboration, not only of talent and resources, but long-term view. These aren't things that you're going to bring a team together and 6 months from now you're going to have a solution. These are things that are going to take years and decades to deal with. And so that lends itself to this idea of openness, transparency, particularly at the fundamental research and education level, to bring those forces together to really optimize conditions globally for the whole planet. And if we don't do this as a planet, the planet won't survive.
Jonathan Watzel, Ernest McDuffie, Liu De Wing, thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Still to come on the program. The $17 billion China-financed high-speed rail linking Kuala Lumpur and Singapore is no longer in pipeline, according to some media reports. How can China manage the risks of mega projects? And what about the other parties as well? Experts weigh in after this. You're watching World Insight. The program comes to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. I'm Tian Wei. Malaysia's recently elected Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad says to the press that he intends to cancel a high-speed rail project linking Kuala Lumpur with Singapore. China, Japan, South Korea and others have been lobbying for the contract to provide trains for the 350-kilometer line, which would have cut travel times to just 90 minutes. But Mahathir says to the press that Malaysia cannot afford it. For its part, the Chinese Foreign Ministry said that China was ready to forge ahead with close cooperation with Malaysia.
Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad says his administration will seek to cancel the China-financed high-speed rail project. The planned high-speed rail link between Kuala Lumpur and Singapore costs more than $17 billion. Before the party's shock election victory on May 9, the Pakatan Harapan Alliance had vowed to review all mega projects.
It is a final decision, but it will take time because we have an agreement with Singapore. It's not beneficial. It's going to cost us a huge sum of money. We'll make no money at all from this operation.
China is also leading the construction of the $15 billion East Coast Rail Link, as well as providing 85% of the funding through soft loans. Mahathir says the government wants to renegotiate terms with China, questioning the necessity, viability and cost of the project. China believes economic and trade cooperation is beneficial for both people.
China and Malaysia are friendly neighbors and have maintained close trade and investment cooperation, which has brought tangible benefits to the people from both sides. We're ready to continue our close cooperation with Malaysia.
According to the new Finance Minister of Malaysia, Lim Guan Ang, total government debt had spiraled to more than 1 trillion ringgit, or 80% of GDP. Malaysia's new leadership says the previous government hid the true scale of the country's debt. Mahathir's government has made it a point to get handle on state debts.
So what's going to happen to that rail link? And what is going to be China's role? What's going to be the change? With me here in Beijing, Zhang Zhenping, who is the Director General for the Center of Regional Cooperation from the Ministry of Commerce. Welcome, sir. Also, in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, we have Dr. Munir Majid, who is the Chairman of the ASEAN Business Advisory Council in Malaysia. I want to welcome both of you, gentlemen. May I understand, first of all, from Dr. Majid, since you are in Malaysia, and I understand since the election, Malaysian politics and policies have been shifting dramatically. Help us to understand what exactly is the latest situation. Despite the enormous amount of media reports, we do not know exactly what is happening right now. Dr. Majid.
I think the decision that has been made in Malaysia to review the high-speed rail project and to try and renegotiate the East Coast rail network is driven primarily by the domestic fiscal situation. As you rightly pointed out, the fiscal situation is actually quite deep. The hole is not a very comfortable one, and the 1 trillion Malaysian ringgit sort of hole that the government finances finds itself in is not a comfortable place to be in. Hence, there has to be, a review. Therefore, Malaysia must set its house in order, especially in terms of financial sustainability, and it has to measure up against these projects, these projects in the context of financial discipline. Otherwise, we might be rolling down the hill financially.
Right. Dr. Majid, if I could just ask a little further, is there a timeline about the review process? How long, in other words, will it take the review? Who is going to do the review? Eventually, who is going to make the decision? And do we know the decision-making process? How about the parties involved so far? Dr. Majid.
Yes, I think, the Prime Minister has said that a review will take place. I think the body that will be mostly involved in that review is a council of eminent persons that was set up by the Prime Minister, comprising a former Finance Minister, Tun Daim Zainuddin, a former Central Bank Governor, Tan Sri Zeti, a former CEO of Petronas, Hassan Marikan, a leading economist called Jomo Sundram, and Malaysia's venerable businessman, Mr. Robert Kwok, based in Hong Kong, as you know. And this committee has been talking and listening to people about their different viewpoints on these projects, As far as high-speed rail is concerned, the problem is when you have a situation as existed before where there was not enough openness and people felt pressured in whatever they said or spoke, in relation to projects, they might not come out with a full, story or the full analysis. We have a more open situation now, and people are now saying, yes, it does not make sense.
All right.
Yes, it is not feasible. Yes, it will take, 75 years to get the money back, assuming, all these assumptions of feasibility in terms of price of tickets, the number of passengers, and so on and so forth.
All right. Under the current circumstances, Mr. Zhang, what does it mean for all the parties, whether they have been participating in trying to getting the contract or in the bidding process, and also in what it would take eventually to get the projects done? It's not just China, but also other countries as well.
I think that right now the things happened in Malaysia actually make us quite confused, also quite disappointed. That for Chinese side, in the past, we already, have so a lot of input on those, high-speed railway projects. But today, due to, the change of government, and then all of the stakeholders get into trouble. Also, maybe we will pay more cost, in the future. So I'm afraid that for Chinese side, it reminds us that in the future we have to consider this type of, unpredictable, huge political risks. And for Chinese, those corporations and the relative stakeholders, we also need to consider how to avoid, the potential risks in the future.
But how to avoid that would be a very tricky question, isn't it? With the change of government in a country like Malaysia, let me ask you, Dr. Majid, what do you think? Would these changes, this is not the only project that has been changed or being on hold. What would this mean to the credibility of Malaysia as a whole? Of course, people understand totally about the feasibility that Malaysians need to think about these projects. But will they mean that 3 years or 4 years from now, if the government changes again, there will be another decision being made about these projects or other projects which this administration is being put into practice? So I guess sustainability and stability is the thing that investors think about. I wonder from Malaysia's side, how do you see that perspective?
I think obviously, when a new government comes in, it will want to review the massive projects, the big projects, and it wants to set it against, the sustainability, the financial sustainability of those projects. And I think when things come out into the open very clearly, it will be indicated whether a project is sustainable or not, objectively speaking. And if that comes out, it's very difficult to reverse, and bring the project again, as you say, the chopping and changing that takes place. So the most important thing is the openness in the discussion, openness in the analysis, and openness in the facts and figures. Insofar as ECRL is concerned, of course, it involves China, and there are certain aspects of the agreement which the present government finds unsatisfactory. And I think it's very important, I think, from China's viewpoint too, in the context of BRI. It's not exactly a BRI project, but in the context of BRI, to show an ability to relook at issues that impinge on financial sustainability. As you recall, as you will know, there's so many criticisms about BRI will impose overpowering financial demands on countries which will do themselves self-harm into getting into projects, which may not actually be financially sustainable, which will place them in a dependent financial position and therefore result in an unequal sort of relationship with China. China believes in an equal relationship, in mutual respect, and also does not believe in undermining any regime or government through its financial failure of that government. Therefore, it is an important point, not just for Malaysia, but also for China, insofar as ECRL is concerned, to relook and have a look.
Got it. Mr. Majid, we got your points. That point has been repeated over and over again about assessment report, openness and things. But let me go to you, Mr. Zhang, as well. So should those participating in this project forget about this project? Because according to Mr. Majid's answer, you don't have a timeline, you don't have a framework yet, you don't know which rules that these assessments will be based on, because they are about so-called gathering information. Should parties involved forget about this project? This also leads to other questions involving about overseas investment for any country, I think for emerging and developing countries particularly, that what kinds of conditions has to be ripe to form a partnership with countries, with companies from other countries, let's just say from other developing and emerging economies? Mr. Zhang.
Yeah. I think that at this time point, actually, from Chinese side, we have our strong, capacity for infrastructure constructions. Meanwhile, including Malaysia and other economies, on platform of BRI, they have strong demand for infrastructure improvement. In this regard, there is a very huge potential. However, I think that by this type of case, remind the Chinese side that in the future we have to fully, consider, the real demand from host countries, and also we need to seek the possible approach to guarantee, those existing negotiations will be, keeping, and how to make guarantees for those existing, contracts.
But that's the question, isn't it? I mean, the question is how? How?
Firstly, I think that in the future, maybe, we will require those government, host countries' government to provide enough guarantee, for our potential corporations. Maybe risks fund, this type of things. Also, will some of, your government, your insurance provided by, a governmental side or by insurance companies in that countries. Also, I think that maybe from Chinese side, we need to consider how to make a joint venture with those host countries in order to, prevent the potential, huge, risks, something like that.
Dr. Majid, according to the Chinese Foreign Ministry, China will continue to have close cooperation with Malaysia, as the Foreign Ministry spokesperson just said. But obviously, this is one of those issues that the Chinese would have in their mind when they are so-called continuing their close cooperation with Malaysia. Dr. Majid, what would that mean for the potential of so-called cooperation?
We are talking here, Malaysia was the first country to establish diplomatic relations with PRC. It's been 44 years, since relations have been established. So it's a long period of relationship. And in those 44 years, 22 of them were under Dr. Mahathir's leadership when he was Prime Minister for the first time.
Right.
It's half the period. And therefore, if you look back and see what his relationship was like with China during his time, you will see that, he has absolutely, no inclination to want to have a bad relationship. In fact, he sees China as a great potential power with whom he wants to engage. And engage with China he did in his time. And therefore, what he is doing now is to review what he thought was something that was agreed upon, which may harm Malaysia's fiscal position. And so it is quite right for a country to look at its self-interest. It doesn't mean that it is projecting against the other country, China. And so people try to interpret these sort of domestic decisions in the context of its external ramifications, and therefore saying it is anti-China or anti-Singapore, which is not the case. It is pro-Malaysia. That's what's being done. Right. Now the question is, I think you asked us now about the future, what we do in the future in terms of contracts and so on. I mean, quite clearly, it doesn't mean the end of the relationship, not necessarily even the end of the ECRL, because they say they want to negotiate it, and China can show that it is able to do so, or there will be other projects. There will be other projects, huge other projects that will come in the future when Malaysia is more capable fiscally to undertake them.
All right. Mr. Zhang, before we go, we only have a minute and a half to go. Mr. Zhang, how is China and other countries, once again, I emphasize on emerging and developing economies. Well, the countries' economies are strengthening their muscles. They are doing more cooperation internationally. But what are some of the most important factors ones have to think about before doing the investing and also before forming partnership? Mr. Zhang, whether this is a case study, typical or not, that's a question mark, but some of the things are still really worth quite some thinking.
For me, I think that the most important thing is that we have to seek, legal supporting framework in host countries. That means, even if there will be potential, change of government, and the existing contract should be protected by, host countries' law and rules and regulations. Meanwhile, I think that for between China and Malaysia and other countries, maybe we will have our bilateral investment treaties or free trade agreements. We hope that this type of umbrella also can provide protection for China's investment in those countries.
Well said to both of you. Thank you so much, Zhang Jianping and Munir Majid. Really appreciate it. With that, we're coming to the end of today's program. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us. World Inside CGTN into your search engine. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on different kinds of social media platforms as well. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Inside team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.